The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a day already gray with a threat of rain and the heavier weight of overdue bills. It was a cruel sliver of cream-colored cardstock in a sea of final notices, its embossed letterhead from a law firm she'd never heard of feeling like an insult. Anya Williams slid her thumb under the seal, her son Leo's crayon drawing of a blue dinosaur taped to the refrigerator beside her, a vibrant splash of innocence against the peeling paint of her reality. The first sentence hit her not like a wave of hope, but like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She had inherited the old Blackwood Silk Mill, a place she only knew as a skeletal ruin on the forgotten edge of town, a monument to decay that had been in her mother's estranged family for generations. And with it, she had inherited $250,000 in back taxes and civic penalties, a debt so vast it felt like a prison sentence. This wasn't a gift, it was an anchor, designed to pull her and her son under for good. If you're just joining us, please hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now back to Anya and the crumbling legacy that was about to change everything. The paper trembled in her hand. $250,000. She made less than a tenth of that in a year, juggling 2 jobs, stretching every dollar until it screamed. The number was an abstraction, a piece of fiction, but the mill was real. She'd driven past it 100 times, a colossal brick carcass slumped against the skyline, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at a world that had long since moved on. It was the town's favorite ghost story, the local eyesore everyone wished would be torn down. And now it was hers, her burden, her curse. The lawyer's dry, formal language offered no comfort, only facts and figures that added up to ruin. The property would be seized by the county in 90 days if the debt wasn't settled. 90 days. It might as well have been 90 seconds. She leaned against the counter, the linoleum cool against her forearms, and closed her eyes, the scent of stale coffee and overwhelming anxiety filling her senses. Leo, oblivious, hummed as he colored, creating a world where blue dinosaurs roamed free. For a moment, she wanted to live there with him, in a place where monsters were made of crayon, and the only thing that crumbled was a cookie. But her world was made of brick and mortar and crushing debt. That evening she drove. She needed to see it, to stand before the thing that was threatening to drown her. Leo was buckled in the back, his face pressed against the glass, his breath fogging a small circle. As they turned onto the overgrown access road, the mill rose from the weeds and shattered asphalt, more imposing up close than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just a building, it was a fortress of failure. The setting sun bled through the broken panes of its highest windows, painting streaks of orange and purple on the grimy brick. A final, beautiful gasp before the darkness settled in. Anya parked the car, the engine ticking as it cooled, and got out. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, of rust, of 100 years of silence. "Wow," Leo whispered from beside her, his small hand finding hers. He wasn't looking at the decay. He was looking at the sheer size of it, the way it touched the sky. In his eyes, it wasn't a ruin. It was a castle, a giant's house. She squeezed his hand, a pang of love and terror striking her at the same time. He saw magic where she saw foreclosure. They walked the perimeter, their footsteps cushioned by moss and dead leaves. A chain-link fence, rusted and torn in places, offered little resistance. She found a gap and, after a moment's hesitation, slipped through, Leo following without question. Standing at the base of the main wall, she felt impossibly small. Red brick, stained black with soot and time, soared upwards, disappearing into the twilight. A massive wooden door, bolted with a slab of iron that had fused with rust, stood like a tombstone. This was her inheritance, a mausoleum of forgotten industry. She circled the building, her hand trailing along the rough, cold brick. She was looking for a way in, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps she felt that to be defeated by it, she first had to understand it. She found a side entrance, its door long gone, the opening covered by a sheet of warped plywood. It was loose. With a grunt, she pulled it aside, revealing a gulf of darkness within. A chill, different from the evening air, washed over her. It was the cold of a place that hadn't felt sunlight in decades. Stay here, she told Leo, her voice tight. She switched on her phone's flashlight, its thin beam cutting a nervous path through the gloom. The inside was a cathedral of rot. Giant skeletal machines, the looms, sat in silent rows, draped in cobwebs as thick as shrouds. Dust motes danced in her light like frantic spirits. The floor was a treacherous landscape of debris and slick patches of moisture. The sheer scale of the dereliction was breathtaking. This was beyond repair. It was an act of archaeology. She ventured deeper, the sound of her own breathing loud in the cavernous space. Then she heard a scuffling noise behind her. "Leo, I told you to wait," she hissed, spinning around. But it was only him, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "It's spooky," he breathed, but he didn't run. He clung to her leg, a small, warm anchor in the cold darkness. With him there, her fear felt selfish. She had to be brave for him. She continued her exploration, moving toward the back of the main weaving floor, where the floor sloped down into what must have been the boiler rooms or storage cellars. A set of concrete steps led into an even deeper blackness. The air grew heavier, colder. The flashlight beam bounced off damp stone walls. This was the building's heart, its foundation. And there, tucked away in an alcove, almost completely hidden by a collapsed section of shelving, she saw it. A door. But this door was different. It wasn't wood. It was a thick slab of iron, flush with the stone, with no visible handle or knob, only a small, intricate keyhole set in its center. It wasn't on the faded blueprints the lawyer had sent her. It was an anomaly, a secret. She ran her fingers over its cold, smooth surface. It was seamless, solid, as if it had been forged from a single piece of metal. It felt ancient and purposeful. A forgotten safe? A panic room? It was nothing. It had to be nothing. Just another dead end in a building full of them. But as she stood there in the subterranean cold, with her son holding her hand and the weight of the world on her shoulders, a tiny irrational flicker of something, not hope, but a defiant curiosity, ignited within her. This place was meant to be her ruin, but for the first time, she wondered if it was hiding something more than just decay. The door was a question mark waiting in the dark. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls and spreadsheets, each conversation a fresh wave of despair. Anya met with a realtor who laughed when she mentioned a sale, a banker who looked at her with pity, and a demolition expert who gave her a quote for tearing the mill down that was nearly as much as her annual salary. Every path led to a dead end, a wall of financial impossibility. The 90-day clock was ticking, each second a hammer blow against her fragile composure. Then a call came from a man named Marcus Thorne, a senior acquisitions manager for Viridian Development. His voice was smooth as polished granite, a confident, practiced sound that immediately set her on edge. He said he'd heard about her unfortunate inheritance and wanted to make her an offer. "We see potential in that area," he'd said, his tone suggesting he was doing her a monumental favor. "We're prepared to offer you $10,000. We'll absorb all the back taxes, handle the demolition. You walk away, clean slate. $10,000 for a property that spanned 5 acres, for a building that, however ruined, was a landmark." It was a predator's offer, designed to prey on her desperation. The insult was so profound it momentarily cleared the fog of her anxiety. "No," she said, the word tasting like metal. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a shift in the polished tone. "Ms. Williams," he said, a hint of condescension creeping in, "I think you misunderstand your position. That building is a liability. In 90 days, the county takes it, and you get nothing but the debt. I'm offering you an exit. I suggest you take it." The threat was veiled, but it was there. He knew her deadline. He knew her vulnerability. The call left her shaking, not with fear, but with a cold, simmering anger. They saw her as a problem to be swept away, a negligible variable in their corporate equation. That night, unable to sleep, she found herself rummaging through a dusty trunk in her closet, a collection of family remnants she'd inherited from her mother. It was mostly filled with faded photographs and old clothes that smelled of mothballs. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a connection to a past she barely knew, a history that had led her to this precipice. At the very bottom, beneath a stack of yellowed linens, was a small, lacquered wooden box. She'd seen it before, but never opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single object, a key. It was unlike any key she had ever seen. It was heavy, made of a dark, tarnished metal that felt warm to the touch. Its head was fashioned into an intricate knot of what looked like stylized threads, and its shaft was impossibly slender, the teeth at the end cut with geometric precision. It was a work of art. With it was a small folded piece of paper, the handwriting a beautiful, looping cursive from another era. What the weaver makes, the guardian keeps. What the world forgets, the heart remembers. It was signed Elara, her great-grandmother. Anya stared at the key, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The intricate keyhole on the iron door in the mill's basement flashed in her mind. It couldn't be. It was a wild, desperate leap of logic, a fantasy born of having no other options. But the image of the door, solid and secret, in the feel of this strange key in her hand, formed a connection she couldn't dismiss. The next day, she told her boss at the diner she had a family emergency. She picked Leo up from school early, the lie tasting bitter in her mouth. The drive to the mill felt different this time. The anger from Marcus Thorne's call had burned away some of her fear, replacing it with a defiant resolve. If she was going to lose everything, she was at least going to know the full extent of what she was losing. She left Leo in the car with her tablet and a juice box, promising to be back in a few minutes. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight and the key clutched in her fist, she slipped back into the cavernous ruin. The silence inside was absolute now, the afternoon light struggling to pierce the grime-caked windows. She moved with a new sense of purpose, her footsteps sure on the debris-strewn floor. She descended the concrete steps into the basement, the damp chill seeping into her bones. There it was, the iron door, impassive and ancient. It looked even more formidable in the harsh glare of her flashlight. Her hand trembled as she approached. This was foolish. She was a single mother with a mountain of debt, chasing a ghost story in a condemned building. She should be on the phone, begging Marcus Thorne to raise his insulting offer, pleading with the county for an extension she knew they wouldn't grant. But she wasn't. She was here, in the dark, with a strange key and a stranger hope. She raised the key to the lock. The air was still, holding its breath. She slid the key into the narrow opening. It fit. It slid in smoothly, perfectly, with a soft, metallic whisper that seemed to echo in the profound silence. For a moment, she just left it there, her fingers resting on the ornate head. This was the point of no return. Turning this key felt like a choice, a commitment to a path she couldn't yet see. She took a deep breath, the cold, musty air filling her lungs. She gripped the key and turned. The mechanism inside was not rusted or stiff. It moved with a well-oiled precision that defied the decades of neglect. There was a series of soft internal clicks, a cascade of tumblers falling into place like a secret password being spoken, and then a deep, resonant thunk that vibrated through the metal of the door and up her arm, a sound so loud in the stillness it felt like the world had shifted on its axis. The sound echoed through the stone-walled cellar, a definitive, final sound of release. The lock was open. She pulled the key out, its metal now feeling warm, alive. The door remained shut, held in place by its own immense weight. There was no handle, but now she saw a tiny, almost invisible seam along the edge. She pressed her fingers into the gap and pushed. The iron slab moved, swinging inward with a low groan, not of rust, but a perfectly balanced mass moving on hidden hinges. A new kind of air washed over her face from the darkness beyond, cool, dry, and clean, carrying a faint, unidentifiable scent, like ozone and old paper and something else, something metallic and sweet. It was the air of a place that had been sealed away from the world, a time capsule waiting to be opened. She stood at the threshold, her flashlight beam cutting into the pristine blackness, and took the first step inside. The beam of Anya's flashlight sliced through the absolute darkness, revealing not a dusty cellar, but a space that was impossibly, unnaturally clean. The floor was smooth, polished stone, and the walls were lined with what looked like dark, lacquered wood. There was no dust, no cobwebs, no sign of the decay that consumed the rest of the mill. It was as if this chamber existed outside of time, perfectly preserved by the hermetic seal of the iron door. The air itself felt different, still and silent, holding a strange electric tension. In the center of the room, sitting on a raised stone dais, was a loom, but it was a machine unlike any she had ever seen or imagined. It was massive, constructed from a dark, swirling wood that resembled polished ebony and inlaid with intricate patterns of brass and copper that gleamed in her light. It was both an industrial machine and a work of art, its gears and shuttles arranged with a jeweler's precision. It looked less like something from a 19th century mill and more like an artifact from a fantasy novel, an instrument of impossible craftsmanship. But it wasn't the loom itself that made her gasp, a sound swallowed by the profound silence of the room. It was what was on the loom. Stretched across its frame was a partially woven tapestry, a textile so extraordinary it seemed to defy the laws of physics. It wasn't threaded with silk or cotton or wool. The warp and weft were made of impossibly fine, hair-thin filaments of metal that shimmered and glowed with their own internal light. In the focus beam of her flashlight, she could see distinct threads of brilliant, buttery yellow gold, of soft, moon-like platinum, and of a warm, rosy copper, all woven together in a pattern of staggering complexity. It was a river of liquid light, a star chart of constellations, a map of a city that never was. The artistry was breathtaking, far beyond mere decoration. It depicted swirling galaxies and intricate biological forms, all rendered in shimmering, precious metal. Anya took a hesitant step closer, her worn-out sneakers silent on the stone floor. She reached out a trembling hand, stopping just short of touching the surface. She could feel a faint, almost imperceptible warmth radiating from it. This wasn't just a tapestry. It was a masterpiece of metallurgy and art, something that shouldn't exist. How could anyone weave metal with such delicate precision? How could filaments so fine be drawn from solid gold and platinum? The sheer material value was staggering. She thought of the gold necklaces in a pawn shop window, the price of a single ounce on the financial news. Here was pounds of it, hundreds of pounds, maybe more, woven into a fabric of pure wealth. The number that flashed through her mind was so large, so absurd, that she felt a wave of dizziness. Millions, tens of millions, more. It was a fortune that could solve every problem she had, and every problem she could ever imagine. The back taxes, the overdue bills, the leaky roof, Leo's future college fund, they all dissolved into triviality in the face of this. A hysterical laugh bubbled in her throat. Marcus Thorne had offered her $10,000 for the land that held this. The irony was so bitter it felt like acid. But as she stood there bathed in the reflected glow of the metallic tapestry, the initial shock of its monetary value began to recede, replaced by a deeper, more unsettling emotion. Awe. This object felt important. It felt sacred. The thought of unraveling it, of melting it down into anonymous, soulless bars of bullion, felt like a profound desecration. It would be like burning a forgotten Da Vinci to keep warm. The pattern was too intricate, the craftsmanship too perfect. It held a story, a purpose, that went far beyond its price per ounce. Her eyes traced the woven lines, and she saw what looked like a signature, not in ink, but woven in threads of silver into the corner of the tapestry. It was the same looping, elegant cursive from the note with the key, Elara, her great-grandmother. The connection was a physical jolt. This wasn't a random treasure. This was part of her history, her bloodline. The woman who had penned that cryptic note had stood in this room, had touched this loom. What the weaver makes, the guardian keeps. Was Elara the weaver, or the guardian? Anya circled the loom slowly, her flashlight beam exploring the corners of the chamber. Against the far wall were several tall, slender cabinets of the same dark wood. She opened one. Inside, on dozens of small spools, were more of the impossible metal threads, neatly organized by color and luster. Gold, silver, platinum, copper, and other metals she couldn't identify, all drawn to a fineness that defied belief. In another cabinet were schematics and journals, bound in dark leather. She opened one. The pages were filled with elegant handwriting and complex diagrams, detailing chemical formulas, metallurgical processes, and intricate weaving patterns. It was the life's work of a genius, an alchemist, an artist. The name signed at the bottom of a page of calculations was not Alara, but a man's name, Alistair Blackwood, the mill's founder, the eccentric industrialist who, local legend said, had squandered his family's fortune on esoteric obsessions before disappearing. He hadn't squandered it. He had transformed it. He had poured it into creating something the world had never seen. Anya sank to her knees on the cold stone floor, the flashlight beam pointing up at the impossible tapestry, making it glitter and dance. The weight of her discovery was heavier than any debt. This wasn't a lottery ticket. It was a legacy. It was a secret history of art and science, hidden away from a world that would never understand. And the key had been left for her. The responsibility settled on her shoulders, a physical pressure. She was no longer just Anya Williams, struggling waitress and single mom. She was the heir to this secret, the next guardian in a chain she never knew existed. The joy of finding a solution to her financial problems was gone, replaced by a terrifying clarity. This treasure would not save her. It would consume her. Because Marcus Thorne and Viridian Development didn't just want the land, they wanted to erase it. And if they ever found out what was hidden in its heart, they wouldn't stop until they had torn it apart, thread by precious thread. The silence of the chamber was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a tomb. And she was the one who had just opened the door. The world outside the secret chamber felt garish and loud. The sunlight that stabbed through the grimy windows of the mill seemed harsh and intrusive after the soft, reflected glow of the tapestry. Anya sealed the iron door, the heavy thunk of the lock echoing her own conflicted heart. She felt like two different people, the woman who had entered the mill, crushed by debt and desperation, and the woman who now walked out, burdened by a secret of unimaginable weight. She couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe her? She could already imagine the conversation with the police or a lawyer. Yes, I found a secret room in my derelict silk mill, and inside is a magical loom weaving a tapestry of solid gold. They would think she was insane or a liar. And if by some miracle they did believe her, the news would trigger a gold rush. The mill would be swarmed by government agents, by corporate sharks, by every opportunist with a metal detector. The tapestry would be seized, cataloged as a state asset, and likely melted down. The loom would become a museum curiosity. The story, the artistry, the legacy of Alistair and Alara would be lost, reduced to a bizarre footnote in the town's history. She needed guidance. She needed someone who could understand the context of what she'd found, someone who could see beyond the dollar signs. She needed a historian. Her search led her to a small, cluttered house on the other side of town, a home overflowing with books and maps. It belonged to Mr. Elias Vance, a retired history professor who was the town's unofficial and often unappreciated chronicler. He had written the definitive book on the region's industrial boom and bust, a book Anya had found in the local library. She knocked on his door, her palms sweating, a folder of photos she'd taken of the tapestry and the loom clutched in her hand. The man who answered was smaller and frailer than she'd imagined, with kind, intelligent eyes behind thick spectacles. He looked at her with a polite but weary skepticism. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a dry rustle of paper. Anya's carefully rehearsed speech evaporated. "My name is Anya Williams," she began, her voice unsteady. I inherited the old Blackwood Silk Mill." Elias Vance's eyebrows rose. "Ah, yes, the Blackwood Folly, a tragic piece of architecture. I heard it had finally been passed down. I assume the developers are circling?" "They are," Anya confirmed. "But I found something, inside. I need you to look at these." She handed him the folder. He took it with a sigh, as if expecting to see photos of cracked foundations or rare species of mold. He shuffled into his living room, which was less a room and more a labyrinth of stacked books, and gestured for her to sit in the only clear chair. He sat opposite her, opened the folder, and put on his reading glasses. For a long moment, he was silent. He picked up the first photograph, a wide shot of the loom in its chamber. He stared at it, his expression unreadable. He moved to the next, a close-up of the tapestry, the metallic threads shimmering even in the low-quality phone picture. He slowly, deliberately, took off his glasses and polished them with a handkerchief from his pocket. He put them back on and looked at the photo again, holding it closer to his face. The skepticism in his eyes was gone, replaced by an expression of such profound astonishment that it bordered on fear. "Good heavens," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Where did you say you found this?" "In a sealed room, in the basement. It wasn't on any of the blueprints." He continued to stare at the photograph, his knuckles white where he gripped the paper. "The alchemist's loom," he said, more to himself than to her. "I'll be damned, it's real." "The what?" Anya asked, leaning forward. "It was a legend," Elias said, his eyes now fixed on her, seeing her for the first time not as a stranger, but as a figure in a story he had only ever read about. A ghost story told by the old mill workers. Alistair Blackwood, the founder, he was brilliant, but he was an outcast. He was a metallurgist, an artist, an engineer. People called him an alchemist. The story was that he spent his last years in seclusion, working on a secret project in the bowels of the mill. A loom that could weave with light itself, that he had found a way to draw precious metals into threads as fine as spider silk. He looked back at the photos, shaking his head in disbelief. Everyone assumed it was a metaphor, a tall tale to explain where all his money went. No one ever believed it was real. He looked up at Anya again, and his academic curiosity was now tinged with a deep and genuine concern. "Young woman," he said, his voice low and serious, "do you have any idea what you have stumbled upon?" "I know it's valuable," she said. "Valuable?" He gave a short, sharp laugh, devoid of humor. "My dear, valuable is a word for stock portfolios in real estate. This is something else entirely. The historical significance alone is immeasurable. A discovery like this rewrites chapters of industrial history, of art history, of science. The material worth, frankly, I can't even begin to calculate it. But that is precisely the problem." He leaned forward, his expression grave. "You must understand. This isn't a treasure you found. It's a target. There are people, powerful collectors, shadowy institutions who have spent fortunes searching for artifacts far less significant than this. The legend of Blackwood's folly has persisted in certain circles for a century. They thought they were hunting a myth. You have found the truth." His words landed like stones, each one adding to the crushing weight on her shoulders. "What do I do?" she whispered. "The first thing you do," he said, his voice firm, "is you tell no one else. Not a soul. You don't call an auction house, you don't call a museum, and you certainly don't call the government. Not yet. They cannot be trusted to understand what this is. They will see a commodity, a raw material to be exploited. They will not see the legacy." He tapped a photo of the signature. "Ilara, your great-grandmother?" Anya nodded. "Then this is your birthright, and your responsibility. Alistair Blackwood created it, but it seems your family was chosen to protect it." He stood up and began to pace the narrow path between his book towers. "This developer, Viridian, they are vultures. They won't stop. An offer of $10,000 means they want the land for pennies. But if they get even a whisper of what's under it, they will become monsters." He stopped and faced her, his eyes blazing with a protective fire. "You haven't found a fortune, Ms. Williams. You've inherited a war, and you are standing on the battlefield." The old historian's words chilled her to the bone. A war. She had been fighting a battle against poverty her whole life, a quiet, grinding struggle. But this was different. This was a war against forces she couldn't comprehend. Forces with endless resources and no morality. And in the center of it all was her, a waitress with a secret worth more than kings could dream of, hidden beneath a building the world had already condemned. The threat Elias Vance had warned of did not take long to materialize. A week after her meeting with the historian, a new offer from Viridian Development appeared in her mailbox. It was no longer a dismissive $10,000. The new number was $250,000, precisely the amount of her tax debt. It was delivered not as a friendly proposal, but as a formal, legally binding offer, with a stark 30-day expiration date. The message was clear. We know your number. We know your deadline. This is your last chance. Marcus Thorne followed up with a phone call. His voice had lost its artificial warmth, replaced by a cold, sharp impatience. Ms. Williams, this is a more than generous offer, he stated, not asked. It's a lifeline. It solves your problem entirely. We take the property, you walk away free and clear. It's time to be realistic. It's not enough, Anya said, the words feeling small and inadequate against his certainty. She could hear him sigh, a sound of theatrical frustration. What's not enough? It's a pile of rubble. We're doing you a favor. Or, he paused, letting the silence hang in the air. Is there something we should know about? Have you found a hidden stash of antique bricks? A rare bird nesting in the rafters? The questions were sarcastic, but they were probing. They were fishing. A cold dread washed over her. Did they know? Was it possible? Or were they just acting on the suspicion that her refusal meant she had a reason? It's a family property, she said, trying to sound firm. I'm not ready to let it go. Family property that's about to be seized by the county, he retorted instantly. Don't be sentimental. Sentimentality is expensive. You have 1 month. He hung up, leaving Anya with a dial tone and a racing heart. The war Elias had spoken of had begun, and this was the first shot across the bow. Her anxiety drove her back to the mill that night. She needed to see the chamber again, to reassure herself that it was real, that she hadn't imagined the entire thing. Under the cover of a moonless sky, she slipped through the fence, her senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every distant dog bark sounded like a threat. As she approached the main entrance, she noticed something wrong. The heavy chain she had refastened on the gate after her last visit was hanging loose. The padlock, a thick industrial model she had bought herself, was still in place, but the metal of the hasp beside it was deeply scored, with fresh, bright scratches in the rust. Someone had tried to pry it open, with force. They had failed, but they had tried. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't just a phone call anymore. Someone had been here. They had been on the property, testing its defenses. She scrambled inside, her flashlight beam jumping erratically, and rushed to the basement. The iron door to the chamber was untouched, its secret safe. But the feeling of violation lingered. The mill was no longer her private burden. It was a contested space. Standing in the silent, perfect chamber, bathed in the golden glow of the tapestry, she was caught between two impossible worlds. Here was a treasure of immeasurable beauty and historical worth. And out there was Marcus Thorne, a man who would happily bulldoze it into dust for a luxury condo development. The moral dilemma that had been a vague unease was now a sharp, painful crisis. The temptation to give in was immense. She could take Viridian's money. It would solve everything. The debt would vanish. She could move, start over, give Leo a life without the constant shadow of poverty. All she had to do was walk away and let the secret be buried forever under tons of concrete. It would be so easy, so simple. But then she looked at the tapestry, at the name Alara woven in silver. She thought of her great-grandmother, a woman she'd never met, who had been entrusted with this secret. She thought of Alistair Blackwood, the visionary who had poured his life and soul into creating this impossible thing. To let it be destroyed would be a betrayal of them both. It would be an act of profound cowardice. But what was the alternative? To fight? How? With what weapons? She had no money, no power, no influence. She was a single mother against a multi-million-dollar corporation. It was a fool's errand. She sat on the cold stone floor, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She could feel the ghost of her great-grandmother in the room, a silent, expectant presence. What the weaver makes, the guardian keeps. It was a commandment, a sacred duty passed down to her. This wasn't just about money versus history. It was about honor. It was about standing for something, even if it meant losing everything. The thought of Leo's face, so full of trust and innocence, flashed in her mind. What kind of lesson would she be teaching him if she took the easy way out? If she sold her soul for $250,000? She would be teaching him that when things get hard, you surrender. That legacy doesn't matter. that beauty is disposable, that the only thing worth having is the thing you can spend. She couldn't do it. The decision settled in her heart, not with a triumphant fanfare, but with a quiet, somber resolve. She would not sell. She would not run. She would be the guardian. She didn't know how she would win. She didn't even know if winning was possible, but she knew she had to fight. As she left the chamber, locking the great iron door behind her, she felt a subtle shift within herself. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in control. Beneath it was a new foundation of purpose, a bedrock of conviction. She was no longer a victim of her inheritance. She was its protector. She walked out of the mill and into the night, the scratches on the gate no longer just a sign of a threat, but a reminder of what she was fighting for. The war had begun, and she had just chosen her side. The decision to fight was one thing. Figuring out how was another entirely. Anya knew she couldn't do it alone. Her first and only ally was Elias Vance. She went to his house the next morning, the story of the new offer and the attempted break-in tumbling out of her in a rush of fear and resolve. He listened patiently, his expression growing more grim with each detail. When she was finished, he nodded slowly. "They're moving faster than I expected," he said. "The offer matching the tax debt is a classic predator tactic. They're trying to corner you. The attempt on the gate shows they're not afraid to cross lines." He gestured for her to follow him into his study, a room even more densely packed with history than the rest of the house. He pulled a heavy, leather-bound tome from a shelf. It was a privately printed history of the county's founding families. He flipped through the brittle pages until he found the entry for Blackwood. Alistair Blackwood was the last of his line, Elias explained, his finger tracing the genealogy. He never married, had no children. When he disappeared, the mill and his assets were absorbed by a distant cousin's family, the Stanfords. They were industrialists with no patience for Alistair's artistic follies. They shuttered the mill and let it rot. Your branch of the family comes from a different line entirely, one they likely never knew existed. He then pointed to a name on a different page. Ilara Vance. Anya stared at the name. Vance? Like you? A sad smile touched the old historian's lips. Ilara was my great-aunt, my grandfather's sister. The family story was always that she was a humble weaver at the mill who died young. A tragedy, but we never knew the truth of her connection to Blackwood. The revelation stunned Anya. Their connection wasn't just academic, it was blood. This was his legacy as much as it was hers. "She was my great-grandmother," Anya whispered, the pieces clicking into place. "This whole time. It seems our families have been guarding this secret together without even knowing it," Elias finished. The shared history forged a new, deeper bond between them. They were no longer just a desperate woman and a helpful historian. They were partners, united by a duty that spanned generations. This new knowledge spurred Anya to dig deeper into her own family's past. She went back to the small wooden box where she'd found the key. Tucked into a false bottom she hadn't noticed before was a small, slim journal, its leather cover cracked with age. It was Ilara's. Her great-grandmother's handwriting filled the pages, not with daily musings, but with observations, calculations, and reflections on her work with Alistair Blackwood. Anya and Elias spent the next several nights poring over the journal, a Rosetta Stone that unlocked the secrets of the Loom chamber. Ilara was not just a weaver, she was a prodigy, a brilliant mathematician and artist whom Alistair had taken on as his secret apprentice. He had seen in her a mind that could comprehend his vision, a spirit that valued creation over commerce. The journal revealed the true purpose of the loom. It was never meant to be a source of wealth. It was an artistic and scientific experiment. Alistair believed that by weaving with elemental materials, he could create a tapestry that was not just a picture of the universe, but a small, resonant piece of it. He called it the Harmonia Machina, the harmony machine. It was a fusion of art, metallurgy, and a philosophy that bordered on the mystical. He wasn't an alchemist trying to create gold. He was an artist trying to create meaning out of the base elements of existence. The journal described the years they spent perfecting the process of drawing metal into thread, of calibrating the loom to handle the unique materials. It was a work of shared passion, but it also spoke of their fears. Alistair knew that the world, especially his own family, would only see the raw value of the gold and platinum. They would never understand the art. They would melt down his life's work without a second thought. So he designed the chamber to be a secret, a vault, and he entrusted its guardianship to the only person he knew would understand, Ilara. The final entries were heartbreaking. Alistair, growing ill and paranoid, made Ilara promise to protect the loom after he was gone. He gave her the key and the knowledge, and then he simply vanished, leaving the world to believe he was an eccentric failure. Ilara kept her promise. She sealed the chamber and lived out her life as a simple weaver, guarding a secret that isolated her from the world. The journal was her only confidant. What the weaver makes, the guardian keeps, Anya read aloud from the final page. He was the weaver, she was the guardian, and now you are, Elias finished softly. Holding the journal, feeling the weight of her great-grandmother's words, Anya finally understood. This was not a burden, it was an honor. She was the living continuation of Ilara's promise. Her own struggles, her own poverty, seemed to shrink in comparison to the quiet, lifelong sacrifice her ancestor had made. She was not just fighting for a building or an artifact. She was fighting for Ilara's legacy, for her quiet courage, for the promise she had kept in secret for so many years. Her resolve hardened from a defensive posture into a proactive one. She was done being afraid. She was done reacting. It was time to find a way to fight back, not just to protect the loom, but to honor it. She had to bring its story into the light, but in a way that would protect it from the very forces its creator had feared. The journal was her shield and her sword. It contained the truth, the story that could change the narrative from one of derelict property to one of priceless cultural heritage. The question was, who could she trust to help her tell it? Armed with the profound knowledge from Ilara's journal, Anya and Elias knew their next step was critical. They couldn't keep the secret forever, but revealing it to the wrong people would be catastrophic. They needed an institution with the resources and reputation to protect the loom, but one with unimpeachable integrity. After weeks of careful research, they settled on the prestigious North American Antiquities Institute, a highly respected nonprofit known for its meticulous preservation work and its ethical approach to cultural artifacts. They made an appointment, not through a general inquiry, but through a personal connection of Elias's from his university days. Their meeting was with the Institute's head curator of industrial artifacts, a man named Dr. Eris Thorne. He was young, charismatic, and radiated an infectious passion for his work. He listened to their story with wide-eyed wonder, his initial professional skepticism melting away as Anya showed him the photos and read passages from Ilara's journal. He was, it seemed, the perfect ally. "This is monumental," Eris said, his voice hushed with reverence as he examined a photo of the tapestry. "It's the discovery of a lifetime. The craftsmanship, the materials. It's a complete paradigm shift." Alistair Blackwood wasn't a madman. He was a visionary, a century ahead of his time. He looked at Anya, his expression one of deep respect. "And your great-grandmother, to have guarded this, the strength that must have taken. Ms. Williams, you have a sacred trust. The Institute would be honored to help you uphold it." Anya felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to tears. For the first time since the letter had arrived, she felt she wasn't alone. Here was someone who understood. Someone who saw the loom not as a pile of money, but as a priceless piece of human history. Over the next few days, they worked with Eris to formulate a plan. It was brilliant in its scope. The Institute would secretly fund the payment of her back taxes through an anonymous benefactor grant, removing the immediate threat from Viridian development. Then their top extraction team, experts in handling delicate and oversized artifacts, would discreetly move the loom and the tapestry to a secure, climate-controlled facility. Once it was safe, they would work with Anya and Elias to prepare a stunning public reveal. A dedicated museum exhibit called The Weaver's Legacy, which would tell the story of Alistair and Ilara. Anya's family would be forever credited as the guardians of this lost treasure. She would receive a substantial finder's fee and an ongoing stipend as a consultant to the exhibit, ensuring her and Leo's financial security for life. It was perfect. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. It honored the legacy, protected the artifact, and secured her family's future. The night before they were set to sign the official agreements, Anya and Elias were invited to a small dinner at Eris's home to celebrate. It was a tasteful, elegant affair. As the evening wound down, Eris stepped away to take a phone call in his study. Anya, on her way to the restroom, passed the partially open study door. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but Eris's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the quiet house. "No, the deal is set, Marcus," he said. "She trusts me completely. The extraction is scheduled for Tuesday. Once we have it, the transfer to Geneva will be seamless. The buyer is prepared to wire the full amount upon confirmation." Anya froze, her hand on the wall to steady herself. Marcus. The name was a shard of ice in her gut. She leaned closer, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Of course she doesn't know about you," Eris continued, his voice dripping with the same condescending tone she remembered from the phone. "As far as she knows, Viridian lost and the good guys won. She gets her little foundation story, the Institute gets a high-quality replica for their exhibit, and we deliver the genuine article to our client. Everyone gets what they want." A cold laugh. "Yes, the land will be yours, free and clear, as soon as the artifact is out. The anonymous grant to pay her taxes is coming from the buyer's down payment. It's perfect. Don't worry, brother. Our family's about to become legendary in more ways than one." Brother. The word hit her like a physical blow. Eris Thorne and Marcus Thorne. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a conspiracy. The entire thing, the reverence, the perfect plan, the promise of protection, had been a lie. A meticulously crafted performance designed to win her trust and steal her inheritance from under her nose. They weren't going to save the loom. They were going to sell it to some anonymous billionaire collector, where it would disappear into a private vault forever. The museum exhibit would be a fraud, a replica to placate the public. And Viridian Development, Marcus's company, would get the land after all, their victory assured by Eris's treachery. The relief she had felt was poison. The hope she had cherished was a trap. The sickness rose in her throat, a bitter taste of betrayal. She backed away from the door silently, her mind reeling. She returned to the living room where Elias was waiting, her face a pale, emotionless mask. She couldn't let them see. She had to pretend everything was fine. She smiled. She thanked Eris for the wonderful evening. She shook his hand, the touch of his skin making her want to recoil. The drive home with Elias was silent. She couldn't bring herself to speak, to shatter his hope as hers had just been shattered. When they pulled up to her apartment, she finally turned to him, the words catching in her throat. "It's a lie," she whispered, the confession filled with a pain that was almost physical. "All of it. Eris, he's working with Marcus. They're brothers." She explained what she had overheard, every venomous word. Elias listened, his face slowly losing its color, his aged features seeming to crumble under the weight of the deceit. The hope that had briefly illuminated his eyes was extinguished, leaving behind a profound and weary sorrow. When she finished, he simply closed his eyes. They had been so close. They had trusted, and they had been betrayed in the most profound way possible by the very institution that was supposed to be the guardian of history. They were back at square one, but worse. Now their enemies knew everything. They knew about the loom, they knew where it was, and they had a plan to take it. And the clock was ticking. The ride back to Elias's house was a blur of streetlights and suffocating silence. The betrayal had left them hollowed out, adrift in a sea of paranoia. They sat in his cluttered office, the scent of old paper and dust, a poor substitute for comfort. The weight of their new reality was crushing. They were utterly, completely alone. The institutions they were supposed to trust were corrupt. The experts were predators in disguise. Every conventional path, lawyers, museums, government agencies, now seemed like a potential trap, a door leading to another version of Eris Thorne. "They played us," Elias said, his voice raspy with defeat. He looked older than he had just a few hours before, the fire in his eyes reduced to embers. "They used my hope, my life's work, against us. They knew a historian would be susceptible to the promise of preservation." Anya felt a surge of guilt. She had been the one to be so completely won over, so ready to believe in the perfect solution Iris had offered. I wanted to believe him, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I wanted it to be over. The fighting, the fear. That's what they count on, Elias said, his gaze distant. They count on our exhaustion, on our desire for a simple answer. For a long while, they just sat there. The ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall was the only sound, each tick a second lost. Viridian's official offer still stood, a constant, mocking temptation. The path of surrender was still open. She could call Marcus Thorne, accept the $250,000, and walk away. It would be an admission of defeat, a betrayal of Alara's legacy, but it would keep her and Leo safe. The Thorne brothers would get what they wanted, and she would be a ghost, vanished from the story. The thought was nauseating. It was the slow, creeping death of her own integrity. No, she had come too far to surrender now. The anger that had been simmering since the phone call with Marcus began to burn away the cold shock of Eris's betrayal. It was a different kind of anger now, not hot and impulsive, but cold, clear, and focused. It was the anger of a protector, a guardian whose trust had been violated. No, she said, the words sharp and clear in the quiet room. Elias looked at her, surprised by the sudden steel in her voice. We can't fight them on their term, she continued, her thoughts beginning to race, to connect in new ways. We've been trying to play their game, the game of money, of contracts, of secret negotiations. That's where they live. That's where they're strong. We'll lose every time if we play that game. She stood up and began to pace, mirroring the way Elias had when they first met. But her energy was different. It wasn't the frantic energy of panic. It was the kinetic energy of an idea being born. What do they fear? She asked, thinking aloud. Marcus and Eris. What is the one thing they can't control? Elias considered it. Their reputations, he said slowly. Viridian development cultivates an image of community building and progress. The Antiquities Institute is built entirely on a foundation of public trust and academic integrity. A scandal? Exactly, Anya said, turning to face him, her eyes bright with a dangerous new light. Their greatest strength is their weakness. They operate in the shadows, using money and influence to get what they want. But what happens if we drag them into the light? What happens if we turn on all the lights? The plan began to form in her mind, a radical departure from everything they had considered before. It was risky, unpredictable, and could easily backfire. But it was theirs. It was a weapon they could wield. They want to control the story, Anya said. Eris was going to tell a beautiful lie about a replica in a museum. We need to tell the true story first, and we need to tell it to everyone. She looked around the room, at the towering stacks of books, the maps, the letters, the physical manifestations of 1,000 true stories. We've been treating Alara's journal as a secret to be protected, but it's not. It's our weapon. The loom, the tapestry, they're not just valuable objects. They're proof. They're the heart of a story that's more powerful than any amount of money. Elias began to understand. A slow spark returned to his eyes. A David and Goliath narrative, he breathed. The single mother, the forgotten history, the corporate vultures trying to steal it all. It's powerful. It's the truth, Anya corrected gently. We don't have to invent anything. We just have to tell it. We can't trust the big institutions, the major newspapers who might be swayed by advertising dollars from companies like Viridian. We need someone independent, someone who isn't afraid to fight. Her mind was already scrolling through names, podcasts, blogs. There was a journalist she'd read about, an investigative reporter named Sarah Jenkins, who had made a name for herself by taking on powerful corporations and winning. She was a freelancer, beholden to no one but her own fierce sense of justice. It was a terrifying gamble. Once the story was out, it was out of their control. The world would descend on them, the good, the bad, and the greedy. But it would also descend on the Thorne brothers. It would put them under a microscope, a spotlight so bright that their shadowy dealings would be impossible to hide. They think we're powerless because we have no money, Anya said, her voice filled with a conviction that amazed even herself. But they're wrong. Our power isn't in money. It's in the truth. It's in the legacy of a woman who kept a promise for a lifetime. We're not going to hide her story anymore. We're going to shout it from the rooftops. She looked at Elias, her partner, her kin in this strange inherited war. Are you with me? He looked at her, at the determined set of her jaw, at the unwavering strength in her eyes. He saw the spirit of his great-aunt Alara looking back at him. He gave a slow, firm nod. Let's give them a war, he said, but let's fight it on our battlefield. Finding Sarah Jenkins was easier than Anya had feared. The journalist guarded her privacy, but Elias, through his network of academic contacts, found a secure way to reach her. Anya wrote the initial email, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she poured out the entire story. The inheritance, the discovery, Ilara's journal, the greed of Viridian, and the devastating betrayal by Eris Thorne. She attached the photos of the Loom and scans of the journal's most poignant pages. She didn't beg or plead. She simply laid out the facts, ending with a single sentence. This is the truth. They are counting on the world never hearing it. She hit send, a feeling of irreversible finality washing over her. For 24 hours, there was only silence. It was the most agonizing day of Anya's life. Every ping from her phone made her jump. She began to second-guess herself. What if Jenkins thought she was a crank? What if she forwarded the email to the authorities? Or worse, to Viridian for a price? The trust she had placed in this unseen stranger felt naive, reckless. Then the reply came. It was short and to the point. Don't talk to anyone else. I'm on a plane. 2 days later, Sarah Jenkins was sitting in Elias Vance's living room. She was a woman who seemed to vibrate with a restless, intelligent energy. Her eyes missed nothing. She listened intently as Anya and Elias recounted the story again, this time with the actual journal and the original key on the table between them. She asked sharp, incisive questions, testing the narrative, looking for holes. But there were none. She examined the photographs with a practiced eye, not for their beauty, but for their authenticity. Finally, she sat back, a grim, determined look on her face. They're going to hate this, she said with a small, tight smile, which means we have to do it. The next few days were a whirlwind. Sarah worked with a ferocious efficiency. She brought in a trusted photographer, a man who worked with her on all her sensitive stories, to discreetly take high-resolution images of the loom and tapestry. Anya led them into the chamber, her heart pounding as another person entered the sacred space. But the photographer moved with a quiet reverence, his focus entirely on capturing the truth of the object, not its value. Sarah conducted long, recorded interviews with both Anya and Elias, drawing out the human story, the legacy of sacrifice and guardianship. She documented every threat from Marcus Thorne, every deceptive promise from Eris. She was not just writing an article, she was building a case. The plan was to bypass the traditional media gatekeepers. Sarah would publish the story on her own independent platform, a site with a massive and loyal following, and simultaneously release it to a network of like-minded journalists and news outlets around the world. They would detonate the story everywhere at once, giving the Thorne brothers and their allies no time to spin a counter-narrative. The night before the story was scheduled to go live, Anya couldn't sleep. She sat in her small living room, the glow of the television flickering on Leo's sleeping face in the next room. The fear was back, a cold, sharp dread. What had she done? She had painted a giant target on her own back, on her son's back. She was inviting the world's chaos into their lives. The story was no longer hers. Soon it would belong to everyone. At dawn, her phone buzzed. It was a link from Sarah. The headline was simple, powerful. The Weaver's Legacy, how a single mother is guarding a priceless American treasure from the heirs of a corporate dynasty. The story went live. For the first hour, there was an unnerving silence. Then the storm broke. The article exploded. It was shared thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of times. It was picked up by news aggregators, by major blogs, by international papers. The comments section was a tidal wave of outrage and support. Weaver's Legacy began trending on social media. Anya's small, anonymous life was over. The story was a perfect storm of injustice, history, and heroism. People were captivated by the image of the secret loom, mesmerized by the quiet dignity of Alara's journal entries, and furious at the blatant greed of Viridian and the treachery of the Antiquities Institute. The Thorne brothers were caught completely off guard. Their carefully constructed worlds began to crumble under the intense glare of public scrutiny. The Institute's phone lines were flooded with angry calls from donors. Viridian's stock took a noticeable dip as investors panicked at the public relations nightmare. Marcus and Eris Thorne, who had operated with the quiet confidence of the powerful, were suddenly infamous. Denials were issued, of course, weak legalistic statements about inaccurate portrayals and misunderstood negotiations. But the evidence Sarah had presented, the timeline, the family connection, the sheer predatory nature of their actions was too compelling. The public wasn't buying it. And then something happened that Anya had never anticipated. The community, her community, began to rally. The Eyesore mill, the place everyone had wanted torn down, was suddenly reframed. It wasn't a ruin anymore. It was a landmark. It was the home of the weaver's loom. That afternoon, as Anya drove past the mill, she saw a small group of people standing outside the fence, holding handmade signs. Save the mill. Honor Alara's legacy. A local news van was parked across the street. The next day, the group was larger. A local contractor showed up with a few of his workers, and without being asked, began patching the holes in the fence and boarding up the broken windows. A history teacher from the local high school brought her class for an impromptu lesson on industrial heritage. Someone started a GoFundMe to help Anya with her legal fees, and small donations began pouring in from all over the country. The weight on Anya's shoulders was still immense, but it was no longer hers to bear alone. She had taken her secret, her burden, and given it to the world. And the world, in a surprising and beautiful act of grace, had decided to help her carry it. She hadn't just exposed her enemies. She had summoned an army of allies. The public revelation was not a magic wand. The Thorne brothers and Viridian development did not simply vanish. They lawyered up, launching a barrage of legal challenges. They claimed Anya was mentally unstable, that the loom was a clever forgery, that their offer had been an act of civic charity. They tried to drown the truth in a flood of legal muck and character assassination. But the narrative was no longer theirs to control. Sarah Jenkins's reporting had been too thorough, the evidence too strong. Every legal attack was met with another wave of public outcry. The Antiquities Institute, facing a full-blown revolt from its board and donors, was forced to suspend Eris Thorne pending an internal investigation. His career was in ruins. Marcus Thorne found his development projects all over the country suddenly facing new levels of scrutiny and local opposition. They had become symbols of corporate greed, their names toxic. The war was far from over, but the battlefield had shifted decisively in Anya's favor. She was no longer just a defendant, she was a cause. The small GoFundMe campaign blossomed into a full-fledged fundraising movement. With the help of Elias and a pro bono legal team that had volunteered their services after reading the story, Anya made a move that solidified her new role. She used the initial wave of donations to pay off the back taxes, freeing the mill from the immediate threat of seizure. It was a monumental victory, a symbolic severing of the last chain Viridian had held over her. With the property secured, she established a non-profit organization, the Alara Vance Foundation. Its name honored both the quiet guardian who had started it all and the steadfast historian who had helped her see it through. The foundation's mission was twofold. First, to protect and preserve the Blackwood Silk Mill and the alchemist's loom within it, and second, to use their story to champion the preservation of other historical landmarks threatened by corporate development. The foundation gave her a platform, a way to channel the outpouring of support into something structured and sustainable. The donations that poured in were no longer just for her, but for the cause. Architects, engineers, and preservation specialists from around the country offered their expertise for free, helping to draft a long-term plan for the mill. The vision was audacious. They would not move the loom. To do so would be to rip it from its context, to turn it into a sterile museum piece. Instead, they would preserve it in situ. They would restore the crumbling silk mill around it. The plan was to transform the Eyesore into a state-of-the-art museum, a community center for arts and technology, and a monument to a forgotten chapter of American ingenuity. The loom chamber would be its heart, preserved behind climate-controlled glass, a sacred space for people to witness the legacy of Alistair and Alara. It was a dream that would require millions of dollars and years of work, but for the first time it felt possible. The mill, once a symbol of her isolation and dread, became a hive of activity. Volunteers organized by the foundation cleared debris, secured the structure, and stood watch, a constant community presence that deterred any further attempts at sabotage. Anya found herself transformed. The shy, overwhelmed woman who had trembled at the thought of a phone call with a developer was now the head of a foundation, giving interviews, directing volunteers, and making decisions that would shape the future of her town. She found a strength she never knew she possessed, a voice she never knew she had. It was Alara's strength, she realized, a quiet, steady resolve passed down through generations. One cool autumn evening, months after the story had broken, Anya stood on what had once been the main weaving floor. The space had been cleared of debris, and temporary lighting cast a warm glow on the old brick walls. Below her in the basement, the loom chamber was safe, protected by a new, high-tech security system paid for by thousands of small donations. Her son Leo stood beside her, his hand in hers. He was no longer looking at a spooky ruin, but at his own future. He saw the volunteers, the architects with their blueprints, the sense of purpose that now filled the once empty space. "Are we going to live here, Mom?" he asked, his voice full of a child's simple wonder. Anya smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "No, sweetie," she said, looking out through a newly installed window at the town lights twinkling below. "We're going to bring it back to life." She hadn't claimed a fortune. She hadn't walked away with a 9-figure bank account. The $423 million, a number the media had sensationalized as the estimated value of the metals, was not hers to spend. It was a symbolic figure representing a value that couldn't be quantified. It was the seed capital for a new legacy, one that would be shared with everyone. The mill was no longer a weight threatening to pull her under. It was a beacon. It was a testament to the idea that some things are worth more than money, that one person's courage, amplified by the support of a community, could stand against the most powerful forces. The fight was not over. The restoration had just begun, and the shadows of greed would always linger. But as she stood there with her son, feeling the solid floor beneath her feet and the hopeful energy of the work ahead, Anya Williams knew, with absolute certainty, that she had chosen the right path. She had not inherited a treasure. She had accepted a trust, and in doing so, had discovered the truest meaning of wealth,